Hey y'all, I'm Mickey Gousset. Today, we're diving into the world of Azure Pipelines and GitHub integration. If you've ever wondered how to keep your code in GitHub while using Azure Pipelines for CI/CD, you're in the right place. Over the next 3 videos, we will explore 3 different ways to make this magic happen: OAuth integration, personal access tokens, and using the Azure Pipelines GitHub app. Now in this video, we are going to dive into setting up OAuth integration between GitHub and Azure Pipelines. Here we go. First up, we have OAuth integration with Azure Pipelines. Now, you might be thinking, what on earth is OAuth? OAuth stands for Open Authorization and is an open standard for access delegation. Let's dive into that a little bit. Think of a cool clubhouse, the DevOps cool clubhouse, with different rooms, and each room has something special. One room has games, another has snacks, another has secret plans. Now, access to the clubhouse is based on a key system. So you have a master key, and only the owner of the clubhouse has the master key, which opens every room. You also have individual room keys, and these are special keys that only open specific rooms. Now let's say that you want to enter the game room. You love games, and you want to go to the game room and play some games. But you don't have the master key, and you don't want to bother the owner every time you want to play. So what do? Well, you need to borrow an individual room key. So first up, you need to ask for permission. You ask the clubhouse owner if you can get a key to the game room. Then you wait for the owner's approval. The owner agrees, but he doesn't give you his master key. Instead, he gives you a special key that only opens the game room. Now you take that special key and you use it to enter the game room whenever you want, without needing to ask the owner again. So how does this relate to OAuth? Well, first, the clubhouse. Think of the clubhouse as your data or the accounts on the internet, like your GitHub account. Think of the rooms as different parts of your data, like a GitHub organization or your repositories. The master key is your password. It gives you full access to everything. And then finally, that special key, well, OAuth is like getting a special key to a specific room. It allows apps to access only what they need without your password. So you may be asking, okay, how does this relate to GitHub and Azure Pipelines? Well, with GitHub, think of GitHub as the clubhouse where your code lives. Think of Azure Pipelines as the service that wants to enter a specific room, in this case, your repositories, to help you build and deploy your projects. Now, why is OAuth safe and convenient? Well, from a security standpoint, your GitHub password remains private and secure. Azure Pipelines only gets to access the things you approve. And it's also got a little bit of simplicity around it. The integration is very smooth and straightforward. You don't have to manually configure anything or share sensitive information. Now that we have an understanding of what OAuth is and how it's related to GitHub and Azure Pipelines integration, let's dive into some demos on setting it up and using it. Okay, so let's get started with kind of an overview of the demo, and then we'll dive straight into it. Now, I have over in Azure DevOps a team project called Parts Unlimited. I created this team project using the Azure DevOps demo generator, and I have gone ahead and migrated this project over to GitHub already using the GitHub Enterprise importer, which I've got some other videos on my channel which will kind of explain to you how those migrations work. But in this case, you can see I've got the repository over here. It called itself Parts Unlimited, Parts Unlimited. And in there, I've got one repository. I've got my Azure Pipelines. So it's all migrated over. Now I'm working with two different users here. I have this user, which is my Mickey Octo demo user. And that user is a project collection admin on Azure DevOps. They're also an organizational owner, which means they're a repository admin on the repository in GitHub. Now, in addition, I have a second user that we're going to be using some. And this user is Octodemo 2. Now, Octodemo 2 is just a regular user in GitHub, and they have write access to the repository. You can see that I'm a regular user because I don't have access to settings here in the organization level. And I don't have access to settings here in the repository. Let's blow this up just a little bit. There we go. That's probably a little bit better. And then over in the Azure DevOps side, I am just a contributor. So I have access to make changes, but I'm not an admin on the collection or on the team project itself. So we're going to start off by working with the regular user, Octodemo 2. So I'm going to come over here to my Azure DevOps pipeline or team project, and we'll go into the team project. And then in the team project, I'm going to go to pipelines. Now, I've created this project came with this pipeline, but I've created just a very basic pipeline for us to work with. And if I look at this pipeline, we go to edit it. Then here is the basic YAML, and you can see all I'm doing is I'm triggering on a push to the default branch, and I'm using a pool called default, which is using a self-hosted runner, and I'm just writing out, echoing out some command lines. And right now, I'm doing everything from within Azure DevOps. So I'm pointing to the Azure DevOps repository, Parts Unlimited. There's an Azure Pipelines basic file in there. If we come in here into the pipeline, we can see here's our pipeline file that was being displayed. Now, first step, now that I've migrated my repository, which I didn't show you, but just, wave our hands and the repository is migrated. The first step is going to be, now I want to go change this pipeline. So more than likely what you do is you come out here to pipelines, and we would go to Parts Unlimited pipeline, and we go edit it, and we come over here to triggers. And I would come over here to YAML, and I would want to change where my source is. I want to change my source from Azure repositories to my GitHub repositories. Now remember, we're showing with this particular video how to do this using the OAuth connection. So we're not using personal access tokens, and we're not using the Azure Pipelines GitHub app. We're trying to create an OAuth connection. So if I change this to say use GitHub, then you'll notice that it's saying that it needs authorization to access the repositories. So it wants to create a new connection for us. And you can see I can either authorize this with OAuth, or I can authorize this with a personal access token. We're going to go with OAuth. So what we're going to do is we'll call this the Mickey Octodemo 2 OAuth connection. And I'm going to click Authorize with OAuth. Now this opens up another window here. And if we look in this window, what we'll see is it's telling us that it wants to authorize the OAuth Azure Pipelines app. Now this is different from just the regular Azure Pipelines GitHub app. This is just authorizing Azure Pipelines to make an OAuth connection. In this case, I want to connect to DevOps Elvis-migrations. And then I want to be able to authorize the pipeline. Well, I have to request a connection because I am not an organizational owner on the GitHub side. Therefore, I need to actually request this connection. So I'm going to request it. So the owner is going to receive an email regarding this request, and I'm asking an org owner at DevOps Elvis Migration Organization in GitHub to allow this OAuth connection to go through. So I'm going to request that approval. You can see that it is accessing request pending. Okay. So if we change over to B, the org owner, then if am I logged in as the wrong person here? But here I am, nope, demo 2. That's good. Nope, that's right. See, this is what happens when you just pick the wrong window. There we go. So now if we log in as the org owner, and we go to settings on the organization, then I can go to GitHub Apps. No, I'm in the repository. So let's go back to the organization level and go to settings. And we can see there's OAuth application policy here. Let's blow this up a little bit. And you can see there's an approval that's been requested by Mickey Octodemo 2. All right, so I'm going to review this. And I'm going to grant this access. And now by granting this access, I should have the ability to now authorize this. Now what I found is if I just click the authorize button here, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I have to close this window and start back over. So let's click the authorize button and see what happens. Oh, in that case it worked. You can now see that I am using a connection called the Mickey Octodemo OAuth 2 connection that I created. And I can come in here and I can say, okay, so let's select. Let's see, we want the DevOps Elvis migrations. All right, so let's load all my repositories. Oh, I misspelled it. DevOps Elvis. There it is. So there's my Parts Unlimited repository. So I'm going to select that repository, which is going to automatically realize that I've got that same Azure Pipelines YAML file. It's going to try to use that master branch. This is all great. This all looks great. And you know what? I'm just going to save this right now. So we're just going to say change to use GitHub. Now let's prove to ourselves that we actually, oh, boom, but look at that. It won't let me save it. Unable to configure a service on the selected GitHub repository. This is likely caused by not having the necessary permission to manage hooks for the selected repository. So what's going on? Well, what's going on if you get this error message is when you're using an OAuth connection and you're doing things such as, if we look at our triggers here, we're triggering in the YAML, say, with a push or with a pull request. Then we have to have a way to have GitHub trigger that information, send that, or kick off the pipeline when you're doing it with an OAuth connection. And we do that with webhooks. So what this is trying to do right here is actually create a webhook to be able to automate the creation of the, or to automate kicking off the pipeline when we do a push or say create a pull request. However, I if you remember, if I come back over here and look, in order to create webhooks, I need to be a repo admin. And I'm not a repository admin right now. So let's change that. Let's fix that problem. So let's come into the repository here, and we'll go to repositories. And let's just go into the settings for the repo. And we're going to add Mickey-Octodemo2. And we're going to make me an admin. So now that I'm an admin, if I go back to here and I try to do a save, we added or change to use GitHub. Oh, I clicked too fast, but ultimately it saved our changes. We can see that by going back to the YAML, and we can see that it is using GitHub. And in fact, now if we go to pipelines and we go to edit this parts unlimited pipeline, you'll notice that the YAML file that it is displaying here is using GitHub. It also realizes we're using an OAuth connection, so therefore it's going to, it prompts us, hey, do you sure you don't want to use the GitHub app? And we're going to look at the GitHub app in a different video. But this is the actual file on the GitHub side. So I could come in here and I could say, you know, echo hello from GitHub. And I'm going to do a validate and save. And this is actually going to create a commit directly into GitHub. So let's save this. And what we should see is a couple of different things happen. First off, you'll notice that we had a pipeline that has been triggered. If we come back over on the GitHub side and we look at the Azure Pipelines file, then you'll notice, oh, wrong one, Azure Pipelines file. Then you'll notice that there's our hello from GitHub. So we were able to edit the YAML directly from Azure Pipelines, but since we're pointing to GitHub, it saves the changes over in GitHub. You'll notice there's currently a check running, or actually it's just passed. So what happened is, because we did that push to GitHub, it triggered the pipeline to run. The pipeline completed successfully. If we come back over here and look inside of GitHub and go back to code, then you'll notice that on that latest push, there's a check. On that latest commit, there's a check that was a successful check that shows that the parts unlimited pipeline ran. And if I click the details, it will take me over to Azure DevOps to show me the details of the pipeline that ran. Now, how did it trigger this pipeline to run? Well, it triggered this pipeline to run by, if we go to the settings of the repository and we go to webhooks, then you'll notice there is a webhook that was created for the push event. So this is basically calling that Azure DevOps pipeline and saying, hey, in the event of a push, go do a trigger. And we can see here's where it recently ran. Now, if we go back over to the Azure DevOps side, we go to project settings, and under pipelines, we go to service connections. You can see that it created a service connection, a Mickey-Octodemo2-OAuth-connection. That's what I called it. And I can go into my service connection. I can see when that service connection was used. I can control who can access that service connection. So by default, the only people that can actually see that service connection are going to be administrators and myself, which is good because I don't want other people accidentally or even on purpose using that service connection, because that's my service connection. It's connecting as me, which means it's going to have access to any repositories that I have access to. So while using an OAuth connection, it's pretty easy. It was pretty easy to set up and use. You do want to be careful in that, making sure that you don't make it where anybody could access that, because then they are connecting as you. They are running as you. And that would be a probably not make security people very happy. Now, as I mentioned, the whole webhooks, needing the webhooks to be able to trigger, say, on a push or trigger on a pull request, that's required because you're making an OAuth connection. If you use the GitHub app, the Azure Pipelines GitHub app, which we'll look at a little bit later in a different video, with that, you don't need the webhooks. So let's try one more thing. Let's try coming back over here to our pipeline. Let's edit our pipeline. And let's see. Let's also edit a trigger on a PR. Is that all we're going to need, or does it require a pattern? Does that do it? No. Okay, so let's try one more thing. So let's come in here and let's add PR. We'll trigger to a PR to master. All right, and let's validate and save. We're gonna see, we'll say the commit message is added PR trigger to master. Now, let's go to triggers and go to triggers And let's not override the YAML. And we're not going to build pull requests from forks of this repo necessarily. All right. So let's save this. Added PR trigger. Click save. So now what we should hopefully see is a couple of things. I'm guessing over here, if we come to the repository and we go to webhooks, we now have a couple more triggers. We trigger on a push, we trigger on a pull request now. We also trigger on a comment to the pull request. Interesting. All right, so let's come into code and let's go into our Azure pipeline and let's make a change. Echo from a pull request. And we're going to commit our changes. We're going to push that to a branch. And we're going to testing Azure Pipelines from PR. And we're going to propose our change. And we will say, please work. I'm going to create a pull request. Now, what we're hoping happens is because I created a pull request, this did kick off a pipeline, and you'll notice that it's showing as a check. Now that's interesting because what that is showing me now is this was kicked off. Now this was kicked off because of the webhook, but what this is showing is I am able to use an Azure pipeline as a check on my pull request. Now this wasn't a required check, right? It just shows as it passed or failed. And you'll notice that if I click the details, that it takes me to the run of the Azure pipeline. But let's try one more thing. Let's go into settings and let's go to branches. Or no, let's go to rules and let's create a new branch rule set. And we're going to call this the please work rule set. And we're going to enable it. And we're not going to let anybody bypass it right now. We're going to target our default branch with it. And we're going to create a rule that requires a pull request before you can merge. But it's also going to require a status check to pass. And I'm going to add a check. And I can search for checks. Now, it's not going to find the check, but since I know the name on the check, because I can see it, right? If I go to this pull request, the name on the check is the same thing that essentially it's the name of the pipeline, Parts Unlimited. So what I can do is I can grab this, and down here where I'm specifying the check, I can just paste it. And now, anytime a check gets created, which means I could even do it through the API, but means a check that's created that has the name Parts Unlimited, it's going to be required. So let's create this rule set. And for those of you that don't know, rule sets are basically the newer version of branch protection rules. And they're what you should be using now instead of branch protection rules. But now, if we come back over here, let's have some fun. Let's go into our repository. Let's go into our pipeline. Let's go to our branch, where we have an open pull request. And because we have an open pull request, if we do a new commit to that branch, it's going to automatically re-trigger any checks. So let's edit this file and let's just do an exit 1. And an exit 1 should make this fail. Making this fail as the commit message. So if we commit that change, and then we go look at our pull request, you'll notice now that it is required. And assuming I did that correctly, it should fail. If I didn't make it fail, still being able to show you that it was required. Back over here on the pipeline side, we can see that it's just starting to run. And let's see what happens. So the pipeline failed. And back over here on the pull request side, it's got to get the response back. But it failed. And now I can't merge. So what this is showing is that when we're triggering these Azure pipelines from within GitHub, and in this case we're doing it with the OAuth, but it also will work with the Azure Pipelines app, we're able to actually use the pipelines as checks on our pull requests. And there you have it. We have shown how, using an OAuth connection, you can connect Azure Pipelines to GitHub repositories, trigger Azure Pipelines on a push or a pull request, and even use Azure Pipelines as a check as part of a repository rule set. In the next video, we're going to look at setting up the same integration, but using a personal access token, or PAT. And we will wrap the series with a look at using the Azure Pipelines GitHub App for integration, which is the preferred method of the three. Thanks for watching.